A year ago, after the end of V being standard format, we received Vowing Sword Dragon. And with the announcement that 2022 was gonna be a what if reverse invasion, we were all really expecting Vowing Saber Dragon. But they gave us Dungaree and made us wait a long time for this one. But the first reverse, can it be worth it? Hey, what's going on, guys? I'm Mr. here. Today we are back to restart V Call season for the second time this year. I'm honestly really hyped, but as you can tell from my background, I'm not actually at home. I'm actually overseas filming this deck profile, as will be the next few, because I'm actually not in the country as I'm doing these videos. I actually picked these up when I went straight to the airport, and that's the end of that. So yeah, so the next few videos will seem a bit out of place. In fact, it's the first time I'm actually filming overseas, so pretty fun for me. But I still had enough time playtesting and actually doing these physically enough to actually present to you. At least for today, it is Vowing Saber Dragon Reverse. So what happens when you print the same card twice is literally what they decided to do for Vowing Saber, but they gave it a little bit of a twist. Twist that a lot of people in the community deem it as broken, too strong, too good, it should be banned, Stunverse should be, thrown into the dustbin, the ban list is going to be wonderful in September and whatnot. But very frankly, I have a very different opinion on Vowing Saber, and it really comes from the nuances in its skill and the fact that it still bears a lot of the same weaknesses that Vowing Sword had, but it does make efforts to fix it. I won't deny that at all. But how you actually are supposed to play Vowing Saber in V series is actually going to shock you, because it's not what most people would actually intend to think of. So I hope this deck profile serves as a pretty good example of what you can do with your Vowing Saber list, and moving forward, what are nicer things that you can also try or mod for yourself. Our grade 3s, we play 4 copies of Vowing Saber Dragon Reverse, Vowing Sword Dragon, as well as 1 copy of Thunderous Beat Dragon. I think we're already starting off to a pretty shaky start, because it's not the first thing you expect. So let's actually break it down real quick. Vowing Sword Dragon is obviously the base form of Vowing Saber Dragon, and he has 2 skills. Well, these skills are important. When a unit is bound from anywhere that's not the deck, your opponent has to make a choice. He either A, binds a normal unit of the same name as the card bound from his deck, and then you choose a unit and then it gains 5k power, or B, you don't bind at all from the deck and you choose a unit, it gains 10k power. So you are effectively making your opponent choose between either giving up his options in the main deck or just gaining more power. Now, here's the fun part. This skill is entirely up to the opponent. So if your opponent just understands what this deck does, you lose before the game even starts. So it's a complete skill check on the opponent. In fact, both skills are actually pretty harmful to yourself, because if you give him option 2, which is to not remove the card from his deck, you only gain 10k power, which is like, okay, it's free, but what are you gonna do with 10k power? This is not any like Gurgit or anything. It's just a stack. But if it is, on the other hand, to actually remove a card from the deck, while yes, you are cutting off his option, you are also at the same time effectively just giving him free deck thinning, which is one of the biggest things you should not be giving your opponent. It's almost like free advantage. So Vowing Sword Dragon, yeah, it's just not that great in my opinion, and neither will Saber. But in Premium, they're like, oh my goodness, Stunverse, you cut out the opponent's deck and kill him. But like I have said about many times over, and I'm sure some people already know, if you counter Stunverse, Vowing Sword's effectively useless. So just keep that in mind. But Vowing Sword does have one more skill, which you don't see often. When rolled upon, you can superior call this card to a rearguard circle. Then for every 2 cards in your damage zone, you choose a card from your opponent's drop zone and bind it. So you effectively now get old school Narukami back, which is like old school G, where you can bind from the drop zone, and this is your choosing this time, not the opponent. So you finally get some self-control over your own cards, and you can actually choose 2 cards from your opponent's drop zone to bind. Now, against some matchups, this is entirely useless, because who cares about the drop. But in other matches, like for example Grand Blue, this could be your huge defining moment in actually turning the game around. But you need to obviously ride something on top of him, which is a tad bit too slow, and it's really just meant to trigger this effect again. But you may be saying, but I just rode on top of Vowing Sword. Why would I have this effect open again? Well, that's because of Vowing Saber Dragon Reverse. Vowing Saber Dragon Reverse is the corrupted form of Vowing Sword Dragon, and he has 3 effects. His second effect is word for word the exact same effect on Vowing Swords first skill. So I don't even need to explain this now. It's literally the same card text. But his first and third skill are new, so that's the fun ones you want to look out for. His best defining trait is definitely skill number 1. Counterblast 1, choose one of your own rearguards and lock it. Your opponent chooses one card from their hand, field, and drop zone and bind them each. So, just hearing that sounds really horrifying. That's -1 from the hand, -1 from the field, -1 from the drop. That must be very threatening. In the late game, this is certainly a very strong finishing move. But in the early game, this is really bad actually. You actually don't want to see this on your first grade 3 turn if you just don't have the requirements. Some opponents just don't call boards in the early game. Some opponents don't even guard in the early game. Well, I mean some do because you have on hits from your Eradicators, like stuff like, for example, Demolition Dragon. But if you never open your Demolition Dragons, then why guard? There is never an actual impetus to guard, so your opponent just won't have that much cards to draw. As for the hand, if he just binds a trigger, you literally just paid CB1 lock 1 just to remove a trigger from his hand, which is alright, that's good, but you're definitely not winning this game, not by a long shot. So do keep that in mind that that's an actual problem with Vowing Saber. It is still very much like Stunverse, entirely based on whatever the opponent decides to do. So if your opponents are grumbling that Stunverse are too strong, chances are they just don't know what to do when they see it. Or the same with Saber, they just don't know how you actually counterplay it. Because once you actually read the skill, you're like, hey, this is not trending at all. Even his third skill is going to suffer from the same effect. When he attacks, if you have a rearguard or a card in soul with Vowing in its name, so Vowing Sword or Vowing Saber can count for this, you Counterblast 1, Soul Blast 1, choose one of your own rearguards and stand it. If you're at 4 more damage, limit break, you stand your whole board of rearguards, not including the Vanguard Saber. So, in the late game, this must sound really horrifying. Wow, with all the power I've accumulated from skill 2, I now get to restand the board at just a CB1 SV1. That must be truly horrifying. But that is if you live that long. If you attempt to use this prematurely, you're paying Counterblast 1, Soul Blast 1 to stand one rearguard, which is... I don't know about you, but Eradicators aren't exactly known for blistering multi-attacks or high-powered rearguards. So, yeah, you're gonna have to really count your losses on that one. That this is not a skill you want to lose in the early game. And if you decide to use both skills in the early game, that's Counterblast 2. That's very resource heavy for, removing one trigger from hand and standing one rearguard. So, do actually think twice before trying to rush into Vowing Saber. You actually do have a few instances where you want to go in the sword first, which sounds completely against everything everyone has said thus far. But I have tested it, and honestly, I now feel really stupid that I'm standing on this side of the fence. So, do take note that cross-break riding sword into Saber is an actually viable option, since Saber is just so good in the late game, but he's still, just like sword, completely horrible in the early game. So, do keep that in mind. After this, a lot of the deck is really self-explanatory, so once you really understand the strengths and flaws of Vowings, the entire deck just fixes itself. And I'll show it to you. The last grade 3 is Eradicator Thunderous Beat Dragon. You may have no idea who he is until today, and yeah, we have good news for you. His skill is during your turn, if a card has been bound from your opponent's side, he gains 10k power. So even from the hand, he's already a 22k beater. That's really good. Eradicators don't have much strong rearguards. This is practically the strongest rearguard, aside from Suhail, who is a natural 19k attacker, because you're playing XL2, right? So, just keeping that in mind, this is definitely the strongest unit in the entire Eradicator ecosystem as a rearguard, so if you want to make sure you have good restands in, he is pretty good, and he does fit in the slots really well. You will be seeing more of him in the future, so do keep in mind this is not someone you want to sleep on. His second skill is when he attacks on the Vanguard Circle, you pay Counterblast 1, he gets a crit. So yeah, really cool for budget Eradicators, but That's only if you ride into him. Very frankly, in a Vowing deck, if you ride into him, you have lost the game. There is no discussion. Moving on to our grade 2s, we play 4 copies of our old friend Eradicator Spark Rage Dragon, 4 copies of Fiendish Blade Eradicator Cho, and 4 copies of Lightning Whip Eradicator Suhail. So let's break it down real quick. We'll cover Suhail. Suhail is a really simple skill. Suhail's skill is when placed on the Vanguard Rearguard circle, you can discard a card from your hand. If your Vanguard's an Eradicator, you draw a card, choose one of your opponent's front row rearguard, and bind it. So yeah, I mean, this is as simple as it gets. Just a nice trade-in 1-for-1 and a free spot retire on that. I mean, come on. It's free. It's completely free. And during your turn, if he's on additional rearguard circle, he gains additional 5k power. Completely free. It's not even a reactive skill like stuff like Zuitan, so feel free to just call as many of this as possible to exile circles and he just becomes 19k. It's a good card. Speaking of cards that are good, we are going to move on into Spark Rage Dragon. Spark Rage Dragon is a card that came from VBT 12, Descendant set, and very frankly, while I started really hating this card on release, I've played it in so many of my Eradicator decks nowadays. I'm just really a fan of this guy, despite the fact that he's still really bad. When placed on the Vanguard circle, he gains 5,000 power. You look at the top 5 cards of your deck, add an Eradicator from among them into your hand, and if you do, discard 1. So it's a literal on-right search from the top 5. And Eradicators, there's quite a lot of them. Your entire deck can be made of Eradicators. And he gains 5k, so even if you fail the search, he's still a 14k beater. Which, you may be wondering, what's the point of having a 14k Vanguard? Second skill. When his attack hits on Vanguard or Rearguard circle, you Soul Blast 1, you draw a card. Wow, that's pretty good. On a Vanguard circle, that's a pretty threatening grade 2 ride. So, yeah, I have nothing to say for it. It's just really good in helping you build advantage. Just feel free to play him because even as a turn 2 on hit, he can pretty much be quite lethal. And of course, our last card is a very, very prolific Eradicator. It is Fiendish Sword Eradicator Cho. When placed on Vanguard or Rearguard circle, Counter Blast 1, your opponent chooses a column, binds the front row rearguard in it, and then he can move the back row rearguard to the front. So yeah, this bypasses resist, it bypasses protection. It's a very effective spot removal for Eradicators. Yes, it's tied to a Counter Blast 1. It's a bit heavy, but considering that you can use it on turn 2 or turn 3 higher, it's also a really good way to stop early game aggression. So, Cho is always welcome. His second skill is when your Vanguard attacks, if there are no units in your opponent's front rows, you Counter Blast 1, you stand this unit. So, yeah, he's a restander as well. But you may be saying, we already have something to restand the board, don't we? Yeah, so this is really a matter of picking and choosing. If you just want to restand 1 on your early game, don't bother paying this cost. Just use Cho's skill and stand himself. But when it comes to the late game, you can just use Saber's skill and then you stand the board. So it's really just a matter of effective resource management. Very frankly, Cho is really more of a, in case you want to use it, he fits in a lot of great niches. But there are just sometimes you just never have to use him, which is maybe for the best. So do take that in mind. I understand that this is a very polarizing pick, especially given the skills of Vowing Saber. But if you give it a try, I mean, you're not going to play stuff like Plasma Catapult, right? You're not going to play Zuitan in this slot. So he's really the only other Eradicator that really just does that. And he gets past Resist. Don't forget, Resist is still out there. So, yeah. Moving on to our grade 1s, we play 4 copies of Eradicator Demolition Dragon. We play 4 copies of Mighty Bolt Dragoon. And we play 4 copies of Isolation Eradicator Nozuku. So it's a very safe list. I mean, at least from this lineup, you really just can't go wrong with that. The list really has just built itself quite well. So let's break him down. I'll start with Mighty Bolt. Mighty Bolt is your traditional grade 3 searcher, and he's conditioned to gain 5k power is if a unit is bound this turn while he's on a rearguard circle. So simple as that. You want a grade 3 searcher because you just want to see Vowings in general. You don't want to clog your whole ecosystem with Vowings though, but you want to make sure you have Sword and Saber at the appropriate time, so use him. Nozuku is your searcher for the archetype. When placed on Vanguard Rearguard Circle, look at the top 5 cards of your deck, add an Eradicator from among them to your hand, and discard 1. It's just a good searcher. There's really no way you can say this is a bad card. because it's just great consistency and it gives Eradicators the one thing that Vanquisher doesn't have, which is actually making sure your plays will 100% come true, even if your plays are infinitely weaker. And of course, one of the main strong points of the archetype is Demolition Dragon. When his attack hits or the boosted attack hits on Vanguard or Rearguard Circle, you can draw a card. Then you can choose to move him into the soul and bind one of the cards in your opponent's back row. So Demolition Dragon, as long as he stays on the field, he's gonna be an on-hit draw no matter what battle he participates in. Wonderful, considering Eradicators are not well known for any form of advantage plussing, unlike Dragonic Vanquisher or Dungaree or literally any other Narukami deck on the planet. But when you don't want him on the board anymore, because you can actually clog your board pretty badly by accident if you don't plan how you actually want to build your field, then you can just throw him into soul and just spot remove something from your opponent's drop, and it will happily trigger your effect of your Vowing Sword or Saber. So yeah, that is actually pretty nice to know that it's just such a well all-rounded card. So do pick this up if you intend to play any form of Eradicators, even Sweep Command or Gauntlet or whatever you want to play. Our grade zeros, we play obviously our Eradicator starter. I mean, come on, we play 6 draw in this deck because you actually do need the pieces much more than anything else. So do keep in mind that that's actually a really good thing you do want to start carrying around. We also play 6 crits because you do need to play crits, and we play the Eradicator heal because you actually do want to see yourself get as much damage as possible, so you might as well. And it is an Eradicator, which means you can search it, so you do actually have the option to actually search for a defensive card like Seovo. And by removing it from your deck, you actually cut down the number of chances you get to heal out. So all in all, it just makes sense altogether to play it, and I really had no problem playing this. I've tried it with Blitz Knuckle, but I still don't think there's a really big issue playing this, so feel free to save a bit of money and still enjoy optimal play. And with that, we actually are done with Vowing Saber Dragon Reverse. I really wish I had more to say because this deck is actually pretty fun if your opponent is quite unwitting. If your opponent doesn't know what's going on, you're effectively going to be watching one of the funniest matches you will ever have in your entire career. However, the second your opponent decides to log on to cardfightweekend.com, you effectively have lost. There is no recovering if your opponent is able to just effectively counter what your own cards read. So that is honestly still the biggest danger with Vowings as a deck, and very frankly, they have kept it up with Vowing Saber for better or for worse. Is this deck worth picking up? I would still say yes. If you are a fan of the reverse invasion, if you're a fan of Vowings, if you're a fan of Eradicators, if you're a fan of Narukami, I would still recommend picking this up because not only is it not that expensive, it's also really fun. However, if you do want to play Narukami competitively, I say you may need to look somewhere else. If you're looking to play Narukami competitive in Premium, Vowing Saber, while it can certainly boost your Vowing Sword decks, you do need to keep in mind the nuances that both bosses have, so that if your opponent just happens to be a little bit smarter, you may have to scoop and move on to the next round. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you all next time. As you know, this is V-Call season. So you know what it means with V-Call season. We are accepting deck requests. So do put them down in the comment section below if there's anything you'd like to see. And if I happen to have the money, you may just see it on the channel. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you all next time. Goodbye.